Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel, where today I'm going to discuss what I read in November. I ended up reading 5 books, but they're kind of all over the place. They don't really follow any sort of discernible, thread, any sort of connection to each other. I just kind of jumped around to see what I wanted to read, and it kind of caused a little bit of a mishmash. And in to summarize early on in this video, basically my general feelings to all these books is that I enjoyed myself while I was reading the books, but I don't think a single one of them really has a lasting impression on me. They're all books I'm happy to have read, and I would recommend in certain circumstances depending on what kind of book you are looking for. But in general, none of these will be favorites. None of these will be books that I think you have to read or anything like that. It's just, they're nice to read. They're good to read. So the first book I read was a new author to me. Not in terms of I've never heard of them before, but just in terms of reading them for the first time. And that is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, book The River Between. And this is basically about this area in Kenya by the Gikuyu people, where it's sort of this community that is separated both metaphorically and physically. What I mean by that is that basically the community has been split in half, and there's one side that is on one side of the mountain, and then it goes into a valley with a river, the river between, and then it goes up the other side again, and then you have the other half of the community. And basically both halves are not only split physically by this river, but they're split sort of metaphorically by the fact that one half is very traditional in their traditional Kenyan ways and their traditional Gikuyu ways, and the other side has been influenced by Christianity, which has been brought recently by white men. And basically this book is about this one man within the society who was sort of raised by his father and raised with the idea that he might become the next sort of a messiah of the community. Not like a Christian messiah, but just someone who can bring peace to the community and sort of bring people together. And his father gives him this advice of study the white man, learn as a white man would learn without becoming a white man yourself. So basically keep your traditional Kenyan, your traditional Gikuyu ways, but use the teachings of the white man to make those ways better for the community. And so basically this book is about his struggle to sort of unite these two sides and really bring the Gikuyu community forward to create a stronger community, basically, that really unites the two. And as the title suggests, The River Between, there's just always going to be a rift between these two. So it's kind of the consequences of that and the ideals between that. So the story is actually quite beautiful and it's quite poignant. I struggled a little bit in the fact that despite this being such a short book, it's about 140 pages, I found it strangely repetitive. There were instances where I just felt, we've already explored these emotions, we've already explored these feelings. I think we could maybe push a little bit more, delve a little bit deeper. And I think that caused me to be a little bored at times within the book. So it was a little bit unfortunate because it is a very interesting topic. It's a very nice topic. The writing is very lovely. But I admittedly was a little bit bored with this one. It's an author I definitely want to revisit with his maybe his longer works. I can't think of the titles right now, but he has a lot more famous ones than this. But I think this was a really good start just to get a feel for the author and get a feel for this area of the world that I'm not as familiar with. But like I said at the beginning of the introduction of this video, while I'm happy to have read this book, it won't have a long-lasting impression on me. I think the ideas behind the book became more important than the book itself, basically. So the next book I read is Scandal by Shusaku Endo. So I haven't read that, despite being a lover of Japanese literature. I've read over 100 books of within Japan, and despite this year I haven't read that much because I've been really exploring books by a lot of different authors this year, and I wanted to get back to Shusaku Endo because I love this author. He writes really, really incredible works, and I think he brings a very interesting perspective, because this is a man who is actually Christian, which is, you know, not very common here in Japanese society, but he was raised Christian. And so he really delves into that topic quite a bit within his books. And so this book really, really surprised me. It's very different from any of the other books he's read. It was almost, I felt like it was sort of like a marriage between Abe Kobo and Murakami Ryu. Not Murakami Haruki. Let's learn, there are other Murakamis. Murakami Ryu. But I felt this book was kind of like a love child of that. The surrealism and the sort of frantic obsession that comes from a Kobo Abe book, and sort of almost more of a grotesque, inner, like, dark, underground, underbelly society of Japan that Murakami Ryu, or sorry, I should say this in the American order, Ryu Murakami explores in his book. So it was kind of an interesting marriage of those two. And so basically what this book is about, and it's almost quite meta, it makes you kind of wonder if Shusaku Endo isn't actually writing a little bit about himself. But it's basically about an author who has just won this literary award. And the author himself is also Christian and has sort of always had very moral, very loving tones in his works of fiction. And so he wins this award finally for basically what is considered his masterpiece of fiction. But on the night of the award ceremony, he sees, while he's giving his speech, he sees someone in the back of the hall who looks just like him. And he's shocked. He's like, who is this person? And the thing is that later on, I think it's his publicist, comes to him and says, what have you been doing lately? I've heard something strange about you. And the author's like, well, what? And the author says, I heard you left a what's it called? A B&M? B-M? S&M. I heard you left a S&M party. And the author's like, me? What? No, that would never happen. And so the publicist is like, oh, yeah, of course. I mean, that's what I thought. It's just something I heard. But obviously, because it's you, that wouldn't actually ever happen. So, sorry, my bad. It's just a little bit of confusion. But as the book goes on, this mysterious figure keeps popping up. This lookalike of the author just keeps showing up. And shows up in the most seediest parts of Tokyo. And it's really destroying the reputation of this author. And the thing is that the author starts to become obsessed with this person. So who is this person who seems to be living my life, but living the seedy version of my life? And so you get this sort of fight between what the author believes is his true self, and this self that this doppelganger is showing to the world. And basically this book becomes this story about how humanity, as much as we want to be very moral people, and as much as we might try to become moral people, at the end of the day, we all have a darkness within ourselves. And the thing is that this darkness has to be accepted as a normal thing. Having darkness does not make you a dark person. It does not make you a bad person. It's just a natural part of humanity that we can't always provide this like 100% pure moral like good to society kind of persona. Like we have there's more to us. So this book really is about that, and it was really quite fascinating. It's not my favorite of Endo's works. I've liked others more, but I did enjoy the topic he goes, because it did really feel like Shusaku Endo was writing about himself, and that was really, really interesting. I don't know how much he actually did put himself into this book, but it was very just incredibly reflective of his own life. And I think it was good to explore this very different style that he chose to write about in this book compared to the other books I've read about him. So I did enjoy this. It's not my favorite by him, but still very, very good. The next book I read was Emily St. John Mandel's The Glass Hotel. I read her Station 11 quite a few, maybe 2-3 years ago, and really, really loved that book. I really enjoy reading a dystopian every once in a while. There's always something interesting about society that you get to learn from reading dystopia. So, and her writing was very beautiful. And so I wanted to try this new book, The Glass Hotel. And it's a book where, when I was reading it, I was engrossed, and I really was captured by her writing, because she has a writing that flows so easily that you really just turn the page. But when I put it down, I wouldn't think about the book at all. And I knew I needed to finish this book within like a week, because if I took any longer than that, I knew I would give up, or I would want to give up, or I would totally lose interest. So it's a book. I was happy when I read it, but I'm very glad it didn't take more than a week, because it's not a must read for me. But yeah, I mean, it's basically about a group of very miserable people and their relationship with other miserable people, and how they stay miserable. Basically, you could say it's a book about, how no matter whether you come from a poor family or a rich family, whether you are poor, whether you're rich, whether you have, an appearance of a life or you don't, no matter what, you can be miserable within all those situations. So you could say the book reflects on that. And yes, it does. But does it reflect on that topic in a way that's actually interesting? No, I don't really think so. I think the thing that really pushes this book forward is Emily St. John Mandel's writing, because as I said, it's so smooth. She is very smooth. Her writing is very smooth. That pushes the book forward. But when it comes to reading about this main character, Vincent, who worked in a hotel, because she worked in a hotel, she meets this one person. They decide to marry each other, but it's sort of more of a contract than it is an actual marriage of love, where basically she has to play this role of a good wife so that he can keep his standing with the society. And in the background, he's participating in this magical financial Ponzi scheme that's destroying the lives of others, but also destroying his life. And it's just a bunch of miserable people who are getting screwed over by other miserable people, and they remain miserable. And there's really nothing more to the book than this. And, Emily St. John Mandel makes this choice to put the ending at the very beginning. And while I understand that, as a literary technique, and I've seen it done very well. It didn't detract from this book at all. I wouldn't say that it was unnecessary, but I also wouldn't say that it was necessary. Maybe the book would have been a little better if we didn't know what would end, just because, I don't know. I mean, if by having the ending at the end, we know the book is going to remain miserable the whole way through. But if we don't have the end at the beginning, then maybe we can go through the book thinking that there's going to be something positive that comes at the end. So, that was the author's choice to tell us, you know what, this is going to be miserable. It's going to remain miserable. Enjoy the ride. But at the end of the day, while this was interesting to read and good to read, it doesn't really do much for me. I didn't get anything out of this. It's just miserable. So it's your choice whether or not you want to read that one. The next book I read was the nonfiction I Attacked Pearl Harbor, the true story told by the midget submarine officer who became United States' first prisoner of war, written by the prisoner of war himself, Kazuo Sakamaki. This is his memoir that he wrote upon returning to Japan, and it reflects on his what happened the night of the attack, what was his role in it, how he was captured, and his life within the prisoner of war camps within the U.S. And this book, although I think historically important, I don't think it went as far as it could have gone, as it should have gone. And because of that, you don't really learn anything new from this, especially compared to, and let me go grab the book where you'll see that I'm wearing just soccer shorts. But let me go grab the book that's same thing as this, but better. All right, so there's another book, and I actually forgot to include this in my nonfiction TBR pile because it's a book that I've actually read 3/4 of it, and it was absolutely fantastic. I was reading it at a time where my mood was kind of like all over the place, so I never finished it, and so it wasn't on my TBR pile. It was in my already read pile, even though I haven't finished the book. But anyway, that book is Taken Captive, a Japanese prisoner of war story. And it's by Oka Shohei, or Shohei Oka, if we're doing the American reading. And the thing, when you're comparing the two, is that this is written by just someone who was an officer. This is written by someone who is an actual author. And so because he's an actual author, he's much more able to properly reflect and write upon his experience as a prisoner of war. So he's able to actually tell you the emotions that were going through his mind. So this is actually the better book and the more interesting book. And Oka Shohei has written one of my favorite Japanese books, which is called Fires on the Plain, which is about a Japanese soldier in the Philippines and basically his sort of, breaking down into despair about his role within the Japanese army. And that book is glorious. It's so beautiful. So that's the author of that story, and he was actually within the same sort of experience. He was at the very end of the war, when Japan was in need of more soldiers, they started going after like older men to join the army. So they were going, like, authors who have no military experience were joining the war, and they never really fought, but they were technically soldiers. And Oka Shohei was pretty much captured immediately. But the thing that you take from this topic is how these Japanese soldiers, they get captured by the Americans, and they're prisoners of war in Americans, and the experience was actually very enlightening to them. It was a positive experience. They can't stop saying how well the Americans treated them, and that's very important to read, because then you read books like the memoir I read earlier in the year, The Bataan Death March, which was a memoir by an American soldier captured by Japanese, and you compare the treatment of American soldiers who are prisoners of war of the Japanese, and Japanese prisoners of war of American soldiers. And the difference in the treatment of humans is just mind-boggling. I mean, Japanese, if you are captured by the Japanese, you're either going to die from torture, starvation, dysentery, poor conditions, torture, all that, or you're going to suffer so much that you're going to, basically have trauma the rest of your life. Versus if you're a Japanese prisoner of war of Americans, you're going to eat chocolate and you're going to banter with the soldiers and you're going to be able to get like cigarette breaks for all your buddies and things like that. So like it's a really, really interesting contrast. And that's what's important about reading these books, because it really shows you how cruel the Japanese were during the war. I read this this past month, and it was interesting and it was good, but it's just an inferior version of this, basically, but still good and interesting because he is the first prisoner of war of America, which makes him historically a very important person. But there could have been more from this. Last book I read this month was The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, and this is the third book I read by H.G. Wells. I've read The Island of Dr. Moreau, and earlier this year I read The War of the Worlds. I say The Invisible Man, I say The Island Dr. Moreau is my favorite so far. This will be my second, and then The World of the Wars. But The Invisible Man, classic story, a scientist discovers a way to make himself invisible, and basically while he thinks invisibility is going to be this incredibly amazing, world-changing ability to have, he discovers how actually limiting and how disastrous an ability this is. And it's basically just how he's brought to this very violent ways out of obsession, out of what's the noun for when you're distraught? I can't think of it right now, but when you're very distraught, and that brings about this noun, this word that I'm trying to bring, but that basically brings you into despair and things like that. And so the more he suffers within society, the more violent he gets, and the more the story just, goes into pure chaos. And the thing, and so that was a very, very interesting topic. But the thing that was really interesting about this book is that it's very dark, but it's so comedic. It's like the first half of the book is like almost a comedy, because, this guy makes himself invisible and he can't un-invisible himself. But he makes himself invisible, and he doesn't think about the fact that he's basically going to be naked all the time because he can't wear clothing, because otherwise there's going to be clothing floating around in the world. So, this man is basically naked the entire book, which, is absurd and comedic, and there's just no way to not make that funny, basically. And then as he gets more violent, and as you sort of get more of a backstory between his situation, then the book becomes very, very dark. So it's really, really interesting, compared to H.G. Wells' other books. So like The Island of Dr. Moreau is pure, it's just dark. It's dark, it's almost grotesque the entire time, and it's actually quite frightening. And this book had very frightening moments in it, but it is very comedic. So it's interesting, the balance between those. And I'm not sure if it actually really does have a good balance. I think it kind of just sort of jumps in terms of mood between the two. But it was very interesting to read, and it's such a classic, and it's good to read the original story and see how much an influence this story had on, science fiction movies in the future, and fantasy and things like that. Like just this idea of invisibility, where it's like, oh yeah, maybe I should also make my clothing invisible, basically. It's just like, can you be invisible without degrading into a bad person? Like, is that possible? So yeah. Anyway, those are the 5 books that I read this month. As I mentioned, kind of all over the place. But you know, that's what keep things interesting, right? I mean, at least I read, and I'm happy to have gotten these off my TBR pile. So yeah, those are the books that I read in November. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Thanks, bye.